Hello, everyone. Welcome to Developmental Psychology, DEP 2004. I am Dr. Rivera. Right, in this section, I want to talk a little bit about the characteristics of neonates. And the first thing I want to hit on is what we call the Apgar Scale. One of the things you're going to read about as you read through this book is all of the different tests that they do on children to gauge their intelligence levels, to gauge their development, etc. But the Apgar scale is trying to gauge how much help a child needs immediately after it is born. Not in a couple of minutes, not in an hour, right that moment. They want to know what this baby looks like, how strong their heartbeat is, whether the baby has control over their muscles, and how well they're breathing. And so they'll look for appearance. What they're looking for mostly is blue. They don't want anything to be blue. You don't want blue hands, palms, um, nails. You don't want blue toes, blue feet, and obviously you don't want to see a blue face. That would mean that this baby is just not breathing or not getting enough oxygen to the point where it might end up dying because of it if they have a blue face. What we want instead is a nice pink baby. We also want a nice healthy pulse of 100 to 140 beats per minute. That means that that baby is healthy. If we're getting close to less than 100 beats per minute or close to zero, something is definitely wrong and something has to be done. What we're looking for, the phase, is a nice grimace. Uh, Now, a grimace is not something we usually associate with nice, but after a baby is born, it's essentially gone from the most comfortable place it'll ever be in, that is the mother's womb, out into the real world. And so there's a good chance that the baby is screaming or at least feeling very bad, and they're going to have a grimace on their face. And we like that because it means they have control over their muscles and they are experiencing sort of the world around them. We also want a good level of activity. We want arms and legs that are flexed, that are resistant to tension. If the doctor pulls on the arm, they want to feel a little bit of tension, the baby pulling back. And what we don't want is a flaccid body, that is a body that does not respond to touch, and the baby does not have control over their body. That might mean, again, that there's not enough oxygen or that the baby is just dying. And then, of course, we want the baby to be breathing heavily. And usually that means having a good, healthy cry, a good, healthy screaming. That means that their lungs are developed well enough and that they are taking in breaths in order to be able to then expel them out, expel that breath out in a good, healthy scream. All of these different points are measured from 0 to 2. 0 meaning absent, to 2, which means healthy. And what we want is when you add all of these up very quickly to get to 7 or more. That means this baby is healthy, and we can go back and look at mom, finish up, get that placenta out, sew up anything that needs to be sewed up, and begin mom through the process of recuperation because the baby is healthy. Anything uh, under that usually means that this baby needs attention right now, or the baby will not be able to continue living. So it just depends on what ends up being wrong with the baby. Now, the Brazelton assessment is going to occur later. What we're looking for here is that the baby is developing well, that they have good control over their motor behavior, that they respond to stress. Um, Adaptive behaviors like reflexes are working, and that they have control over their physiological states. And these actually have just a bunch of different questions and specific things that the doctors and nurses are looking for. So they need to take some time in order to check all of these up. That's completely different than the Apgar scale, which is just basically 5 questions, and we're just going 0 to 2. It's either there or it's not, or it's just a little bit, there's something slightly wrong. And so, where the Apgar scale is immediate and is to make sure that the baby is alive and will be healthy enough to stay alive, in the Brazelton neonatal behavioral assessment scale, what we're looking for is everything developing right? Now, one of the things that we might look for are the reflexes. And I just want to talk about a handful of reflexes. I'm going to talk about these individually. But a reflex is a response, a physical response to some stimulus that is natural. Um, it's probably instinctual to some level, and it happens. The baby is not cognitively thinking about doing these things. The body just does it when it responds to the stimulus. Some of these reflexes seem to be left over from some ancient time, and some of them are things that will eventually develop into voluntary behaviors. The Moro reflex, you'll see there at the top where I write Moro and then I write more hugs, please. That's just a way to remember that Moro is the reflex where the baby will stretch out their hands and then kind of come in for a little bit of a hug. They'll pull them in for a hug. I kind of mentioned that this might be a reflex that is just left over from some ancient time when this behavior was important. Quite likely when babies needed to hold on to mom, especially when they were scared or something along those lines. Especially when they were scared, babies will often do this in response to noise or to a change in position. And what you can see there is that they're kind of pulling in, like if they're trying to hold something or someone close. So the tonic neck reflex, I kind of give again a little bit of a way to remember tonic neck. There's a stretch and a flex. They stretch out one hand and they flex the other one behind them. This is a reflex, and eventually it just goes away. During pruning, as the baby is learning more things, well, this reflex stops being reinforced neurologically, and so eventually it gets pruned away, and then the baby just stops doing it altogether. Rooting is also a behavior or a reflex that will get pruned away with time. If you touch your adult friend's lip, they don't naturally turn their head and try to suck your finger there, right? That's not a reflex that exists in adults, but it is a reflex that exists in infants. If you touch a baby's cheek, the baby will turn and try to suckle. And specifically, this is a reflex that is important in order to keep the baby alive. Rooting goes hand in hand with sucking, which is also a reflex. And both of these are important in order to attach the mouth to the breast or to the bottle, and then to begin sucking and suckling the milk that they are going to need for food. Where rooting will eventually get pruned away, sucking will eventually become voluntary, and you will have voluntary control of that. Here is a grasping reflex. Uh, Babies have very strong grasps, much stronger than you expect. And again, it probably goes back to some ancient time when babies needed to be able to hold on to mom on their own. Well, we haven't needed to do that in probably 200 or 300,000 years, because that's not the way humans carry babies. We carry the babies on our own. The adult carries the baby. But this reflex of having a very strong grip still exists. This is a stepping reflex. This is one that will eventually become voluntary. And obviously, a baby cannot hold their own weight up. But if the adult holds their weights for them, when the baby's foot touches the floor, they will go into a stepping reflex. Again, over the years, and it'll take quite some time, but over the years, this will become a voluntary behavior. Another thing that's important to remember about babies, about infants, is that they sleep a lot. Um, Babies sleep about 2/3 of their days. They don't sleep, however, the way adults sleep. Adults have a long day, maybe 16 hours of wakefulness, and then 8 hours of sleep. Not all adults have that pattern, but it is a common adult pattern. Babies don't sleep like that. Babies are awake for 1 hour and then they go to sleep for 3 hours. Why is this happening? Well, the most likely reason why that's happening is because babies are taking in a lot of information in that 1 hour. They're seeing faces and things that they like to eat, things that they don't want to eat. They put things in their mouth. They're being passed around, et cetera, et cetera. And all of that information, the brain needs time to process them and make the connections that it needs to make. And those things, those connections, um, occur during sleep. Specifically, they occur during REM sleep. During REM sleep, whether you're an adult or a child, your brain goes through all of your memories. Any memory that is important gets reinforced. And any memory that might not be important or is deemed non important then might just end up getting deleted. But um, because a baby is brand new, everything that they're doing for the first time. And so they need a lot of sleep in order to be able to internalize those things at the cognitive or neurological level. Um, they're awake for 1 hour and then they have 3 hours of sleep where they rest, but also they go through the REM cycle in order to make sense of everything that they've experienced during that 1 hour. As children get older, they also start to regulate their sleep patterns, where they sleep more and more during the night. Oftentimes, young children need naps, um, and as they get older, they stop doing that quite as much. Now, another way that infants are studied is through their level of activity. There's a problem with infants is that number one, they don't talk. And number two, they don't do a whole lot. And so, what you're looking for when you're studying them, when you're observing them, isn't the same things as when you're looking at an adult. And so, in sleep, we're going to look at quiet sleep. Quiet sleep is their non REM sleep when they're literally resting. Their breathing becomes regular, their eyes are closed, little to no movement, as opposed to their REM sleep. Remember, REM means rapid eye movement. This is when your brain is working at the same level, sometimes at even higher levels than when you're awake, because it's processing all of that information. The breathing becomes irregular. The baby is still sleeping, and so his eyes are closed, but now they have the rapid eye movement and a lot of muscle twitches. Again, because part of what's happening in REM sleep is that the brain is taking the body through like a diagnostic. Does everything feel just right? Another state where you might study babies in is during their drowsy period. This is just when babies are getting sleepy. Sometimes they will resist falling asleep and they'll get cranky. But what we're going to see is regular uh, breathing or irregular breathing, and they're kind of trying to stay awake. Eyes open or closed, again, depending on how drowsy they are, and little movement. These next two are some of the ways that we can gauge what is happening in the child's mind. Alert inactivity occurs when the baby is focused on something. That is, the baby is paying attention and they're trying to figure something out. And so what we see is that their focus is very strong. Regular breathing, eyes open, they're looking around, usually at something specific, but their body isn't moving a lot because what they're doing is that they're putting all of their effort into focusing. This is opposed to the alert activity. Here, the baby is awake, but they're not really focused or paying attention to anything in particular. And so what we see is more irregular breathing patterns, eyes open, and a lot of body movements. And then, of course, um, another thing that babies do a whole lot is cry. Um, and crying will have a lot of irregular breaths depending on how strongly they're breathing, excuse me, how strongly they're crying. Their eyes may be open or closed, but there is a lot of movement and, of course, a lot of crying. Usually, parents get really good at telling cries apart, cries that begin with annoyance and sort of end up just being sort of angry cries, as opposed to cries of pain, where the baby just sort of goes into a scream right away. And then from a scream, they might stop and take deep breaths and then scream again. Moms get very good at telling those types of cries apart. And sometimes baby will be crying and mom will barely be paying attention to that baby. But if their cry changes, mom will notice at an unconscious level sometimes what's happening. Why did the babies change their cry? Um, and they'll go looking to make sure that baby is okay. And then let me talk briefly here about what we call SIDS, or sudden infant death syndrome. What happens in SIDS is that mom and dad put baby down to go to sleep. And when mom and dad wake up or come back, the baby has passed away, the baby has died. There are a lot of reasons why this happens, but the two most common reasons is that the baby is put to sleep on their chest, or the baby has too many things on it, and either the baby overheats or they stop being able to breathe because something stops their airflow. Now, when we're talking about putting a baby to sleep on their chest, we're talking about infants here, right? Kids who are younger than 1 year old. After 1 year old, usually the babies can turn on their own. And so if they're having a trouble breathing, they can just turn. But before that, they cannot, or at least some of them cannot. And so all of the baby's weight is on their chest. And every time that baby breathes, it has to expand its chest and lungs. But all of that weight makes it harder. And so um, essentially, the baby will start taking more and more shallow breaths. And if it continues for too long, their breath might become so shallow that they just stop breathing altogether. One of the things that happens sometimes is that parents will tell you, I put my baby to sleep on their belly because they fall asleep faster. And when they are on their back, they don't fall asleep. And what you want to remind that parent is that the reason that baby is falling asleep faster is because, in fact, they're not breathing very well. And again, I'm talking about children who are in infancy. Um, because they're not breathing well, their breath becomes more shallow, and it quote unquote makes it easier for them to just kind of pass out and fall asleep. That's not good. Um, you want to put your baby to sleep on their back. Some parents have a fear that if the baby spits up, if the baby throws up, they might choke on their spit up. But babies have a natural reflex to turn their head if that were to happen. And so it's very unlikely that that would happen. However, some parents just kind of go in the middle way where they put the baby to sleep on their side, and that works too. The problem is that it's really hard to keep a baby on their side. And so parents will sometimes use like a pillow or a blanket to keep the baby on their side. And that's fine, but you have to watch that baby because sometimes what will happen is the baby will kind of topple over and their face will be on a blanket or on a pillow or just on the mat. And now they can't breathe because they've obstructed their nose and mouth. And this is a problem with anything extra you put in that crib with the baby. A toy. Um, Usually we put babies in like onesies, and so it's unnecessary to also give the baby a blanket. Um, and it also increases the chances that the baby will overheat. And when you overheat at night, you throw your sheets off of you, or you might stick your foot out to balance out the cold versus heat. But an infant can't do that. An infant can't say, like, oh, I'm super hot. Let me take this onesie off, or let me throw this blanket off of me. And so they may overheat, and overheating can also lead to death. Now, there are other things that can lead to SIDS. Some of the things you see here are more correlation than they are causal. So males and bottle-fed babies are sometimes more likely to develop SIDS, that is, pass away. This probably has more to do with the fact that in a society like ours, where going back to natural caregiving techniques like breastfeeding are seen as, sort of things that the higher class does, or things that people who have, a lot of free time might do. Well, the opposite is true then, right? Parents who work a lot um, might not have time to do all of those little, old style, traditional caregiving techniques. And so moms who work, especially, are going to probably uh, depend a lot more on bottle feeding than moms who can stay home. And quite likely it is that uh, variable, having less resources, that is closer to being causal for SIDS than the actual bottle feeding. And the same thing is true with male babies. Male Human males tend to be stronger than human females in adulthood, but the difference between a male infant and a female infant are almost non-existent, especially when we're talking about strength or how much they need other people, etc. And so male babies are much more likely to be treated more roughly, and to sort of be left alone crying for longer periods of time. And so that is likely the causal aspect, or closer to the causal variable than the maleness of the baby. Again, the same thing is probably true with babies who are of African American descent. More people of African American descent and Latino descent in the United States are likely to be poor or lower middle class than um, the percentage of white Americans who fall in those socioeconomic groups. And so, quite likely, again, it is the lack of resources, the lack of maybe education that is related to that. However, there are some things that may be causal, things like moms who smoke, or babies who live around people who smoke around them. That might weaken their respiratory system. Babies who have respiratory infections, again, that might be a lot closer to being causal. Sometimes parents put their babies to sleep with them in their bed, in the parent's bed. And so unfortunately, sometimes they roll over on the baby. And again, that could be considered to be causal there as opposed to just correlations. But of course, as I mentioned, the overheating and the lack of breathing caused by sleeping on their bellies tend to be the highest two reasons for SIDS. And when you correct for those, what we see is SIDS fall as a cause of death dramatically in infants. All right, everyone, thanks for watching. Let me know if you have any questions. And remember that the best way to contact me is directly through Canvas. I hope to hear from you soon.